Hello, and welcome to Virtual Investor Conferences. My name is John Viglotti on behalf of OTC Markets, as well as our co-hosts, Murdoch Capital Partners and TAA Advisory. We're very pleased you joined us for our keynote presentation discussing the sustainability conundrum. And before I introduce our speaker, please note that you can submit your questions for the presenter in the question box to the left of the slides. And all of today's presentations will be recorded and available for 24/7 replay. At this point, I'm very pleased to welcome our keynote presenter, Jack Lifton. He's the executive chairman of the Critical Minerals Institute. Welcome back, Jack.
Thank you. Today's discussion I'm going to have with you is I've entitled, "Can the production of the necessary critical metals for a total green energy transition be scaled up to meet the demand anytime soon?" That's a very windy way of saying that I'll bet that all of you listening to me are not paying attention to the limitations of a man's ability to access natural resources economically. We seem to have forgotten this. Let me tell you a quick old man story. 15 years ago, I started looking at this topic, and I calculated how much of metals were being produced worldwide. And what I found was that there were really just two or three classes of metals at the time. One was the base metals, which I call the structural metals, like steel, iron, aluminum, copper, magnesium, things like that we used to build things. Then there were the more exotic metals, so to speak, things like manganese, chrome, molybdenum, tungsten, things that we basically use to alloy with iron to make specialty steels. But a third group had come in, and the third group was what I decided didn't have a name. So I baptized them myself as the technology metals. And by that I meant the metals whose electronic properties enable us to make miniaturized devices for the transmission of energy, radio, computers, cell phones, television, things that require more than base metals or the metals used to make alloys of base metals. And in that time, 2007, I decided a cutoff was 20,000 tons a year. Now, that may sound like a lot to you, but that's the typical production worldwide of silver. And so I decided that would be my cutoff grade for rare metals. Below that was a rare metal. Well, guess which one came up next? That's right, lithium. In 2007, 16,000 tons of lithium as metal were produced. Just to give you a comparison, this year there'll be 100,000 tons of lithium as metal produced. That's 6 times as much. We'll come back to that. Okay, what was the use of the technology metals in 2007? Well, cell phones, television screens, computers, things like that. And there was no particular shortage of any of them. And yet people were buying cell phones in those days by the millions of units a week, millions a week. Everybody that you know in the Western Northern Hemisphere world had a television set, at least one cell phone. All Americans had a personal computer. Guess what? There was no shortage of any of the metals' electronic properties of which enable those devices to be made. So, what's happening? Well, around that same time, a guy who made a whole bunch of money in, I think it was PayPal, a guy named Elon Musk, he was in his about 30, 35 at the time, he decided that the rechargeable batteries, which we were using in all of our portable devices, our cell phones, our computers, things like that, could be scaled up. Keep that word in mind, scale. And those batteries could be made large enough to power a car. Well, there were people then making batteries of that size. That's true. And he managed to get a hold of some, and lo and behold, he made a car. And that car, uh, I believe in those days, had a range of about 100 miles. And he knew that wasn't good enough, but people were willing to buy them and try them. An electric car, that was a novelty. Um, General Motors had tried it twice that I remember. Once in the late 70s and then again in the late 90s. They made an electric car with lead acid batteries, rechargeable batteries of the type that you older fellows can remember were under the hood of all of your internal combustion cars. They still are. And uh, a very large number of those batteries in a General Motors car called an EV1, Electric Vehicle 1, in 1998 gave it a 100-mile range. But the 100 miles wasn't enough, and it wasn't a lot. And, they made a couple of thousand of them for political reasons, and they leased them all in California. And then California had passed a rule in the 90s that by the end of the century, uh, 2% of all cars sold in California had to have zero emissions. Well, the only car anybody could think of with zero emissions was an electric car. So General Motors made a couple of thousand of these cars for the California market, assuming that those cars would be all it needed to make to meet this California standard. Well, California repealed the standard in 97 or 98 after some heavy-duty lobbying by General Motors, surprise. And so when those cars leases came up, General Motors said, okay, everybody's got to turn them back. Well, a lot of people wanted to buy them. And General Motors said no. They recovered all of them and they scrapped them. They crushed them and put them back in the furnace and made new internal combustion engine cars. At the same time, though, Toyota had gone on a different route. Toyota had taken a technology which was developed by the American company International Harvester, and they created a mass-produced hybrid car. They call it the Prius. And they didn't use lead-acid batteries for the battery portion of this car, which had both internal combustion and electric motors. They decided to use something called the nickel metal hydride battery, which had been developed in Detroit by a company that I worked for at the beginning. And those batteries were about 60% more efficient than the lead acid batteries, but they cost a lot more money. So Toyota, however, started producing this Prius in 1997, introduced into California in 1999, even though it wasn't necessary at the time. And lo and behold, in the last 25 years, they've sold several million of them. But beginning in the late first decade of the 21st century, they switched out this nickel metal hydride battery to lithium ion batteries, which had become available. Okay, in the meantime, in the real world, where most of us live who didn't drive an electric car, didn't thought Priuses were cute, but didn't want anything like that, we were using altogether of lithium ion batteries, chips made with germanium and gallium, rare earth permanent magnets with neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium. We were allocation among Western people, I would guess, of all those elements put together, average probably kilogram per person, maybe less, but I'm being generous. Okay, so there was no shortage of any of them. But what was lurking in the background was not an increase in cell phones or personal computers, because we had plenty of rare earth elements and lithium and gallium for that. It was this electric car, actually battery-powered electric car. Nobody's paying attention, of course, especially not the miners. Lithium was not a very expensive material. It was in surplus. The rare earths were controlled by China, and no matter how much nonsense was put into the marketplace by Molycorp, for example, in those days about how the American military depended on rare earth permanent magnets for the efficiency of its smart weapons, the U.S. Department of Defense took a different viewpoint because they felt that a soldier's mission was to break things and kill people, and he could do that with a stick or a stone. Didn't have to worry about a specialized bomb. Now, what's happened in the last few years is that politically, the idea of doing away with fossil fuels has caught fire in the non-Chinese world. And so the politicians and their very, very resource illiterate advisors have decided we're going to switch over from the cheapest, most universally available form of energy ever found by the human race, coal, oil, and gas, and we're going to switch over to production of energy not involving carbon. Well, what are we going to need to do that? Well, we're going to produce lithium-ion battery-powered cars. We're going to produce wind turbines, generators, which use it's called direct drive types. They use rare earth permanent magnet generators, and we're going to convert all of our energy production to use only these what I'm going to call energy intensive elements, which have been defined by someone else as lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel, and let's say the rare earth elements. These all together are what's absolutely necessary and critical to make the switchover away from fossil fuel. And so a friend of mine, formerly of Queensland University in Australia, and now with the National University in Finland, has been researching the topic of where are we going to get all these materials which 15 years ago were rare, exotic materials. Where are we going to get them, and how much are we going to need? These are the same problem. Let's switch to the second slide here. Okay. My friend in Finland, Professor Simon Michaud, has written a 50-page document. This is page 43 or 4, I think. So I'm urging all of you to look on the website for this conference and find the total paper. But this is the result of his analysis and work. And Professor Michaud started out as a geologist and an expert in explosives. He blew holes in the ground to loosen up the ore to get metal. Now, I don't know if you can all read this, but I just want to highlight a couple of things because I'm talking too long, I'm sure. We need lithium to make lithium-ion batteries. There is no doubt. You can make lithium-ion batteries with a variety of cathodes, but every one of them contains lithium. And a 100 kilowatt-hour battery, the typical size in a Tesla today, contains between 6 and 8 kilograms of lithium as metal. So, in case you're not aware of it, just between the United States and Europe, there are about 700 million vehicles on the road. In the world, there's about 1.4 billion internal combustion engine powered motor vehicles. That does not include freight vehicles. Okay, so what would it take to give each one of these a 100 kilowatt hour battery? Okay, well, Professor Michaud has calculated it. And the column here is called total metal required to produce one generation of technology units to phase out fossil fuels. So for lithium, that would be approximately 950 million tons. Okay, well, this year we're producing, let's say, 95,000 tons. So that would take, at that rate, to produce about 10,000 years. You could probably see there's a problem here. But let's go on and look at, for example, graphite. Every lithium ion battery, no matter what the cathode chemistry today, is using a graphite anode. These have turned out to be the best. So to put graphite anodes in all those cars would take 8.9 billion tons. Now the world produces 1,000,000 tons a year of graphite. So that would only take 3,287 years to produce enough graphite. I urge you to look at this table when you have time, but I think I've made my point. I'm not saying that we're not going to do a lot of reduction of our use of fossil fuels in the next few years. What I'm telling you is that to make any impact just on cars could take, it won't take 10,000 years because there isn't enough lithium. In fact, the accessible economic deposits of lithium, the ones that we can get at and produce from, will probably only allow a tiny fraction of this to happen. Okay, once we've made a few million of these cars, and I think this year they'll sell a few million, 10 or 11 years from now, when they get scrapped, we'll be able to recycle and continue to make the same number as we scrap. That's recycling of automotive metals is very efficient. Okay. There's going to be now no way to increase the production of these critical metals for energy by anything near the amount needed for a total transformation. I'm not saying that you should forget about this, because the world's major car makers have now gone whole hog into this. Everyone has totally invested in electrification. However, I'm 82, so I may not see the end of this bet. I'm going to bet that by the end of this decade, we will have less car makers, because some of them are going to go bankrupt because they will have powered up to make millions and tens of millions. The typical production today is 100 million cars a year worldwide, of which US and Europe account for 40% and China 25%. At the end of this decade, I would be very surprised if there were enough lithium to make batteries for more than 15 or 20 million of that 100 million. Some of these companies will then be, if that happens and people do buy these cars, a lot of these companies will be out of business. We're going into a free-for-all now. The best investment you guys can make, and I'm not an investment advisor, I'm just telling you my perspective, would be lithium, graphite, nickel, cobalt, rare earths. All of these metals are critical for electrification of cars and the production of wind turbines. And all of these metals are going to be in serious deficit by the middle of this decade. And it's going to be a free-for-all. I leave you with one thought. Please don't think the prices of these metals can go up infinitely to cover the increasing cost of producing from lower and lower grade mines as we exhaust them, because the automotive industry cannot afford open-ended pricing. There's a limit, and those limits are already being discussed in the halls of Detroit and Stuttgart and Wolfsburg. And we've reached the limit with lithium. The price just can't go up anymore. The so-called balancing of the price of batteries with with the cost of gasoline is now long shrouded in the past. Batteries are already the most expensive part of making a car, and they're going up dramatically. At some point, people will not be able to afford to buy these cars, and the car companies will not be able to afford to buy the raw materials. That's got to stop. But when we reach that limit in price, for example, in lithium, that's going to shake out who can produce and make a profit at that price. Right now, everybody can do it because the price is so high. But keep in mind that there isn't enough metal to go around. There is not going to be enough metal to go around. We, the human race, have high graded all of our mines for 150 years. In other words, taking out the highest grade, the easiest stuff to get at. It's getting more and more expensive to mine, and the demand is not what it was in 2007. It's 10 and 20 times what it was then. So good luck to all of you.